Well, maybe I'll welcome those of you who have come for this seminar in the Durham Energy Institute series of seminars. Welcome one and all. And it's with great pleasure today to welcome Vicky Kasprowicz, who's from the University of Sussex, whose brilliant PhD I was lucky enough to review and examine. And let me maybe just for the interest of other DEI members, just say a couple of words about the other colleague we have here, Dave Ockwell from Sussex Geography, who was one of the founder members of the Low Carbon Energy for Development Network, which was initiated with the DEI very strongly in support. Tom McLeish back in 2012 fronted up some money to get the whole thing going. And we've had 12 or so years of fascinating network activity looking at low carbon development, low carbon energy in developing world contexts. So we'll invite Vicky to present her talk, and then hopefully we'll have a moment at the end for some Q&A. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over, Vicky, to you for your own introduction to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Ben. So I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you can see that okay. Your side, yeah.
Good.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ben. Sorry, just move you here as well slightly. And hi everyone. Yeah, it's great to be here today. I'm sorry I have a croaky voice. I seem to have partly lost it, but hopefully you can hear me okay as we go through. Today I'm going to talk you through some research that I've been doing into the relationship between gender and energy, focusing on how and why electricity access impacts gender relations when modern energy first reaches off-grid communities. This is often referred to as the gender-energy nexus. This research comes from my PhD, as Ben mentioned, at the University of Sussex, and I'm currently working with my PhD supervisors, Professor David Ockwell, Dr. Elizabeth Mills, and Dr. Rob Benn at Sussex to condense this into a paper that we're hoping to submit to ERSS. So I'd like to recognise their significant contributions to this work. And also it's great to be here and have the opportunity to talk to you because we'd really appreciate any feedback or thoughts you have on it. So to give you an overview, I'll talk through the research context, my aims, the approach I took, my findings and my conclusions. So to set the context, today 675 million people still live without access to electricity. However, this number has fallen significantly over the past few decades, from 1.5 billion in 1998. And part of the reason for increased modern energy access across the globe is the delivery of off-grid solar services and products in remote areas where people don't have access to their national electricity grid. From a policy perspective, delivering United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 7 to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable and modern energy for all has long been recognised as having potentially significant impacts for gender equality. Access to modern energy is therefore acknowledged as a core element of delivering against SDG 5 to achieve gender equality and to empower all women and girls. And examples of an assumed favourable relationship between SDGs 5 and 7 are clearly articulated in multiple international development policy documents. However, these analyses have come under criticism for their almost blind assumption that investment in electricity access is good for women, with the benefits trickling down to them, and therefore kind of supporting greater gender equality. So whilst still in its infancy, a nascent literature exists on gender and energy access, and this presents a more nuanced, mixed and less well understood picture of the empirical reality of this complex nexus. This demonstrates how the arrival of electricity appears to be influenced by, influence gender power relations in messy and often unexpected ways. There are indeed examples where electricity access appears to have transformative impacts on gender relations. For example, I don't know if people have heard of the Solar Sisters project, in which women report significant benefits from selling solar lanterns, including the incomes they earn and the higher status they achieve socially in their communities. However, there are others in which the reverse is true, and electricity access seems to reinforce or even worsen existing relations. Some studies, for example, suggest women's labour is simply transferred to other unpaid labour, such as livestock care, or elsewhere, men are observed to dominate electricity for watching television, while women continue to work long hours in kitchens lit by kerosene lamps. So given the billions of dollars have been and are being invested in delivering against SDG 7, with the assumption that this will in turn contribute positively to the achievement of SDG 5, there is an urgent need to better understand and also to be able to anticipate how and why electricity access is likely to have positive or negative impacts on gender equality. I'm just going to have some water for my throat. So when considering how to achieve this better understanding of the gender-energy nexus, scholars have identified various issues within the current energy access discourse. For instance, Fathala and Pia Carroll highlight the unhelpful tendency towards a conflation of biological sex and gender, as well as a use of the term gender to refer to women only. Similarly, Winther, Listow and Abdonor argue that women are often essentialized in the energy access discourse, as either victims of energy poverty or as game changers, with electrical appliances sometimes positioned as saviours for such women. In addition, despite significant contributions already made by the gender energy literature, there is acknowledgement that further research is needed to better understand the complexities of this relationship. For example, Margaret Skutch has emphasised that the literature is much stronger on describing how electricity access interacts with gender, and it's weaker on understanding why such interactions occur. Also, as Skutch and Clancy note, many studies to date are more kind of snapshots of particular cases in particular places, helpfully showing the significant variation in the gender energy nexus, but without a kind of systematic or comparative analysis to understand why these variations are happening. And then more recently, Listow, among others, has called for a focus on the power relations of this relationship, highlighting a lack of focus on the practices and the structures which sustain inequality. So in my research, I aimed to address these issues by weaving together theoretical perspectives from both the gender studies and social practice theory literatures to develop a new theoretical framework for understanding the gendered impacts of electricity access. My aim with this was to contribute to the gender energy literature by understanding both how and why electricity access interacts with gender in the way it does, and illustrating this through two off-grid case studies in Guatemala and Colombia, in which two populations use the same pay-as-you-go solar energy service with very different gender structures. So I'll just talk you through some of the literature that I'm bringing together. To start with, drawing on the gender studies scholarship, I adopt a social relational view of gender as something that's influenced by a broad web of place-specific social relations. This view is based on Massey's seminal work that highlights how someone's experience of gender varies across different contexts due to the social relations that come together and intensify in different places and influence everyday practices through which gender is experienced. So in the context of my research, this highlights the need to attend to the insights of the Latin American gender studies literatures. And this is important for providing understandings of how gender is experienced in the region in question, rather than allowing Anglo-American descriptions of such social phenomena to dominate. Excuse me. And also, in addition, drawing on pivotal work by Crenshaw and Young, I understand gender to be an intersectional social identity, with someone's experience of gender being strongly influenced by how this identity intersects with many other identities, such as electricity access level, ethnicity, age, socioeconomic background, family position, and so on. As such, I view experiences of gender as being power-filled, with the power relations of gender being compounded by those of other identities. As work by Connell, Budgeon, Shippers and Allberg highlights, gender is a deeply power-filled structure, with the relationship between masculinity and femininity being maintained through power relations that can vary in terms of their hierarchy and plurality. And as Allberg conceptualizes, this power is often wielded through the meanings of everyday practices, often in hidden ways, as givens or norms that go unquestioned. And then closely linked to this idea, I draw on work by Barbara Risman, suggesting that gender is dynamic and recursive, with the structure of gender and human agency influencing one another as a constantly evolving process. And then finally, as a thread that kind of underpins each of these ideas above, I adopt a performative view of gender as something that is done, sustained, reproduced, negotiated, resisted, challenged, and redefined through daily activities or practices. And this comes from Weston Zimmerman's theorization of gender as something we do. And in addition, by drawing on work by Butler, I view gender as something that can be performative in the sense that it can be done normatively in line with local or gender expectations, or non-normatively in a way that challenges or potentially redefines such expectations. So with a performative kind of perspective of a doing of gender in mind, I then bring in insights offered by social practice theory, and I suggest that a performative view of gender aligns with an understanding that access to electricity only becomes meaningful through appliance use as part of everyday practices. As already mentioned, connections between gender and practices are commonplace within the gender studies literature. So building on work by Shove and Walker, I argue that when communities access electricity for the first time, this electricity becomes meaningful when it intersects with existing everyday practices such as cooking, working, studying, as well as when it facilitates new practices, perhaps such as communicating by mobile phones or watching television. And some scholars have already focused on practices as a way of understanding the gender-energy nexus. For example, Tanya Winther and colleagues emphasised importance on social practices as a helpful lens, conceptual lens, and their work looks at Bordeaux's kind of perspective on practices and his emphasis on habitus. And in addition, Johnson et al. Operationalise Stevenson's energy cultures framework, which shares much in common with a social practice perspective, placing an emphasis on what they call material culture, energy practices, and norms. So kind of building on these existing contributions, I argue that Shove, Panzer and Watson's approach to social practice theory has a key contribution to make when understanding the gendered impacts of electricity access. Within their theorization of social practice theory, Shove et al. Position practices as the central means through which social change occurs. They suggest that practices are what we do with our lives, with such practices stringing together to form our days, weeks, months, and years. And they also conceptualize practices as consisting of three linked elements: materials, competences, and meanings. And as detailed here, they describe materials as objects, infrastructures, tools, hardware, and the body itself, which of course involves electric appliances. They also define competences as knowledge and understanding to evaluate a performance or skills to perform. And they define meanings as social and symbolic significance of participation at any one moment. And finally, they suggest that practices as entities are carried by networks of people through their performance. So bringing these bodies of literature together, my research develops a theoretical framework through which to explore how gender and energy access come together through social practices involving electric appliances. This starts with the elements of social practice theory, with electric appliances forming one material within them, and then introduces gender performativity as something that is done through practice participation. This framework has changed quite a lot during my research. It started off with many methodological kind of rings around it, and it's also still in progress. Been debated quite a lot between us all, and if you have any feedback at me, it would be very welcome. I'll talk you next through my data collection, and then return to this framework to kind of add to it to illustrate what I found. To conduct my research, I formed a partnership with a Guatemalan company called Kingo, who deliver a pay-as-you-go solar energy service to remote communities in Guatemala and Colombia. This company provides solar home systems to customers via their local shopkeepers, and it trains the shopkeepers to sell solar credit by the day, the week, or the month. And customers then buy electricity that they want to use for the time they want and activate their system with a code. This model was set up to kind of mirror the existing practices of buying candles and kerosene, continuing the relationship with the shopkeepers. As just mentioned, to operationalize and further develop my framework, I chose to explore appliance use as an empirical entry point through which to study social practices and gender performativity and how they come together. I conducted interviews, focus groups, and observations in 2 case study areas to ask people about the appliances in their homes and ask them about their daily routines and their practices that they use them for, focusing largely on appliances powered by Kingo's service, including lighting, cell phones, DVD players, and televisions. People showed me their appliances and demonstrated or described the practices that they use them for. And within this work, I aim to capture the lived realities of the people I spoke with and ground my framework and understanding in what I saw, drawing on Aurora and Sterling's call for research to embrace, celebrate, respect, and nurture the pluriverse and a diversity of ways of knowing and living. These are my 2 case studies. At the time I was living in Guatemala and I had previously worked for Kingo, so I knew the regions it served well. For my first case study, I chose to visit 16 Mayan-influenced communities in the 2 northern Guatemalan departments called Alta Verapaz and Petén. And for my second case study, I visited 9 Wayuu settlements in the La Guajira Peninsula in the north of Colombia. I chose these areas because both populations were using the same pay-as-you-go solar energy service. However, they represented 2 very different gender contexts. The gender structure in Mayan-influenced communities is strongly patriarchal, whereas the gender structure in Wayuu settlements is a matrilineal one, with assets power passed down the mother's line. So I'm going to share some findings from an exploration of lighting and cell phone use in these 2 case studies with you, as it offers a useful comparison, hopefully, through which we can discuss the performative nature of the gender-energy nexus. So starting with case study 1, when exploring how and why electric lighting and cell phone use impact gender in these communities, social practice theory focuses our attention immediately on the practices that electric appliances are prioritized for. This is helpful because it shows that electric lighting is overwhelmingly prioritized for cooking by almost all women and men in this case study area, with very few exceptions. In addition, cell phones are prioritized to support cooking and other domestic practices such as laundry and childcare. A practice lens also illustrates the ways in which light bulbs and cell phones influence cooking. Firstly, as new material elements within this practice, light bulbs replace candles and kerosene, and along with cell phones, they join other cooking materials such as subsistence crops, locally purchased food supplies, a wood-burning stove, and a diesel-powered corn mill. Secondly, these appliances link with various competencies necessary for making tortillas, which is a staple food within this region. And these involve things like dehusking, shuking, cooking and grinding of corn, as well as the forming of dough into tortillas and cooking of the tortillas over a fire. They also involve 6 to 8 hours of physical strength, labour and patience daily, with time spent collecting water from the pump or river, preparing cooking corn on a fire outside of the house, and at the mill grinding that into the dough, buying the kind of accompanying groceries, and then cooking everything on the stove. And thirdly, the light bulbs and cell phones link with multiple meanings associated with cooking. And in this area, they are things such as survival, subsistence living, femininity, a woman's contribution as defined by God, Mayan ethnicity, and more. So building on what social practice theory kind of helps us to see within this practice, and an understanding of its elements, it's also possible to think about who carries or participates in this practice, and how that's changing with electricity access. This highlights how cooking is almost exclusively done by women and girls, and also that the arrival of electricity doesn't appear to change who cooks. Instead, it provides greater visibility, control and flexibility within the practice of cooking, which is actually then used to extend the length of women's workdays. For instance, many women described the happiness and clarity that electric light brought to their cooking. They also explained that this light and access to cell phones as torches and alarms allowed them to wake and prepare breakfast and lunch an hour or two earlier than normal at 4 a.m. Rather than 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. And as some men noted, this was important because it enabled them to go to work in the fields earlier to grow the corn, and to return home earlier in the afternoons rather than working for as long as they did normally in the heat of the sun. And many women commented that the light bulbs also allowed them to cook later into the evening to prepare a better family dinner. So both women and men described how cell phones kind of supported women in this work, as entertainment, as communication, and also as childcare. So combining kind of insights from social practice theory now with insights from gender study, the gender studies literature, allows us to take a kind of next step in understanding more about how electricity access influences gender, and also why it does. To begin with, understanding gender as performative provides another way of kind of looking at who's carrying cooking. And instead, we can see cooking as a significant means through which femininity in this region is normatively performed. And this is a helpful explanation, I think, for why electric lighting and cell phones are mostly used to reinforce normative performances of gender through cooking. And we can see that women's use of these materials, it doesn't change the accepted meanings of the practice of cooking. Instead, those meanings continue, and light bulbs and cell phones become recursively part of how women perform femininity through cooking. And then to explore this further, if we attend to power relations, this gives us another insight into the meanings of cooking, and we can see how these meanings become largely seen as givens, or they already are, largely seen as givens that go unquestioned by most people because they are underpinned by strong gender power relations. For instance, the feminine meanings of cooking simultaneously preserve gender difference and preserve male dominance through the social expectation that men provide and women cook. I heard comments such as the man must fulfill his obligations first so that the woman can fulfill hers. If not, she cannot do anything even if she wants to. And as such, the opportunity for women and men to perform their gender non-normatively through these practices is discouraged and reduced by the strong patriarchal gender power structure within which they sit. I did, however, observe some more hidden, less overt shifts in gender relations, from access to cell phones. For instance, in one group, some men showed frustration that women were using the cell phones to find out about human rights, and saying that they would report them for violence. And a few women also in a community with internet coverage, they said that often they message one another and get distracted from their cooking duties. However, despite some of these kind of more nuanced shifts, this appliance was overwhelmingly prioritized to support women to cook. And then moving on to an understanding of the kind of intersectional nature of gender also helps the kind of our understanding here. It highlights how the two social identities, gender and energy access, intersect with one another through cooking, whilst also being sort of influenced by an individual's other social identities, such as their socioeconomic level, their age, health, ethnicity, and more. And through this, we can see that within this area in Guatemala, most women have similar socioeconomic levels, livelihood access opportunities, energy access, gender expectations, and ethnic backgrounds. And all of these kind of come together to compound the need to make tortillas from subsistence farming, maintaining the kind of various gendered meanings of cooking. And also the power relations that underpin these then kind of restrict opportunities for non-normative performances of gender, recursively kind of reinforcing that performativity further. There were, again, exceptions with intersectionality, with looking at it at the relationship through this perspective. Some people were in a position of need or a position of privilege, and as a result, I saw they were able to overcome some of the kind of gender norms around cooking. For instance, some women who were without husbands, they used their electric lighting and cell phones for work to earn an income rather than to extend their cooking times. And that was seen as acceptable by their peers. And also one young girl, she used her access to electricity to start or to grow. She'd already started a shop, and her mum positioned her ability to do that as because she had really good math skills, and that kind of made her special in her mum's eyes as perhaps not needing to get married and cook for her family, but instead use her skills in this way. However, the girl did say to me that she wondered how that might work for her later on, due to the social relations within her community. And so lastly, kind of bringing that into then the place-based social relations of the area in question, kind of looking at the social relational aspect of gender is helpful because it shows that the kind of social relations of Alta Verapaz and Petén are very slow changing. These communities are surrounded by arable cornfields, with most people's wealth formed from the land that they own and cultivate. And there are very few alternative livelihoods available for most communities. And so, yeah, again, these social relations kind of reinforce that the existing meanings of cooking as something that people do for survival. And so hopefully that kind of all starting to fit together. If I now go on to case study 2, mirroring some of the examples in the gender energy access literature. In this case, despite electricity access being delivered by the same company, same business model, the gendered impacts of electricity access look very different in Wayuu settlements in rural Colombia than they do in the first case study. Here, electricity seems to be more widely transformative in its interactions with gender relations, albeit with many layers of nuance and complexity. Light bulbs in this context are used for cooking by some women, but they are prioritized by most women and some men for the weaving of artisanal handicrafts during the evenings as a means of income generation. Looking at cell phones in this context also reveals a different picture to rural Guatemala. Here, cell phones are largely prioritized by both women and men for their use in income earning and for travel. So they're used for day-to-day communication between family members, regardless of gender, and to support travel to urban areas by motor taxi or bus for the sale of finished handicrafts and the purchase of weaving supplies. Studying light bulbs and cell phones as material elements, a social practice theory helps us to do, reveals that until electricity access arrived in such areas, the practice of weaving only took place in daytime hours. And as a result, light bulbs and cell phones don't replace other materials within the practice, but instead make the previous daytime practice of weaving possible, as well as social in the evenings. Weaving materials in this context include cottons, needles, scissors, seats, wooden structures, electric light bulbs and cell phones. And in preparation for weaving, artisans travel to local towns to choose and purchase the cottons they need. And then when a woven handicraft is ready to sell, artisans travel back to local towns to sell and use the proceeds to buy groceries and purchase weaving materials ready for their next creation. And next, thinking about competences involved in weaving, it's also helpful kind of to understand that weaving is largely defined by cultural gender rules. When Wayuu women come of age, they're taught to weave by their mothers or another close female relative during a period of confinement. Every Wayuu woman shares this confinement experience as a rite of passage. And men don't learn to weave in this way. However, as I will explore a bit further, some men are starting to learn weaving skills and techniques from their wives due to some recent shifts occurring in this practice. Exploring the meanings of weaving highlights the traditional cultural values associated with Wayuu handicraft making as an expression of both Wayuu ethnicity and femininity. In addition, it highlights the relatively new and increasing significance of the meanings of income earning and the financial independence within this practice. And exploring this element of weaving therefore draws our attention to how weaving is changing in this region and leads us to question why this is so. And then finally, from a practice perspective, kind of building on these understandings, we can see that in keeping with traditionally feminine meanings, weaving is almost exclusively performed by women. However, as already noted, instead of weaving just taking part in the daytime, it's now taking part in the evenings. So there's a kind of shift in that participation, and some men are starting to weave also with this shift. And then return to the concept of gender performativity, suggests that weaving is a significant means through which Wayuu femininity is normatively performed for cultural reasons. However, also illustrates, helps us to see that this practice is an increasing means through which Wayuu femininity and masculinity are being non-normatively performed to earn an income through the selling of artisanal handicrafts. This provides an explanation of why electric lighting and cell phone use are expanding how gender is performed through weaving. It highlights how women's use of material elements, including electricity, as income earners is changing the accepted meanings of the practice of weaving. In other words, as women are starting to make an income and in some cases achieve financial independence from this work, the meanings of weaving are broadening to include economic provision and financial independence, which stretch how female artisans perform their femininity, as well as overlap with existing notions of masculinity. So using this framing, we can then attend to gender power relations to better understand how and why such opportunities for changes in this practice might exist. As we saw in the last case study, the opportunities for change were very minimal. In Wayuu society, the society is well known for its complex matrilineal gender structure. And taking this into account is helpful because it suggests that one reason why there might be an opportunity for the traditional meanings of weaving to be questioned and widened through electricity access is because the gender power relations underpinning them are less hierarchical and more plural in nature than in the first case study. In this sense, weaving is not a means through which male dominance is particularly reproduced. And finally, where women and men both weave, focusing on gender power relations also draws our attention to the fact that a difference must always exist and be maintained between femininity and masculinity, which highlights kind of how men and women perform this practice in slightly different ways. For instance, some men explained to me and showed me that they make the bag straps and the belts with a macrame or knot making style technique, whereas the women weave the main part of the bags with needles, as well as using a large wooden frame to make hammocks. And then adding two final layers to this explanation, the gender studies literature draws our attention to how this intersectional relationship is compounded by the power relations of other social identities. So this highlights how women are especially well placed to take advantage of electricity access to earn an income through weaving, because they already have competences in this practice through their feminine Wayuu identities and experiences. This practice is also available to many women due to their identities and roles as wives and mothers, which often limit their mobility to the home for domestic tasks and childcare, both in the evening and the day. As one woman explained to me, women have more time to weave than men, as men must often be away from the home to build or repair things within the settlement or away working. And also, both when speaking to women and men, and when reading the regional literatures, it seems that Wayuu women have traditionally taken on teaching roles within the family, as well as travelled to urban areas and handled money, with these experiences supporting women's participation in weaving as a livelihood. And then coupled with these insights, taking an intersectional and social relational perspective illustrates that most Wayuu clans are experiencing significant challenges to their traditional livelihoods, with some ways of living, such as agriculture and goat herding, becoming vulnerable or unsustainable, and other livelihoods, such as weaving and also teaching and some paid work in urban areas, becoming more available. As when many women also commented to me, weaving is their priority because it helps them to support their families, especially at a time that is difficult for men. And one man explained that although weaving used to just be for women, now men see women making good money from it, and so they're leaving their male pride behind it and doing it also. So bringing this to a close, the analysis that we've just been through hopefully provides examples of how and why electricity is intersecting very differently with how femininity and masculinity are done in the two case study areas. In the rural Guatemalan context, electricity seems to be largely reinforcing existing and unequal gender norms by solidifying rather than challenging the doing of femininity through lengthy domestic activities such as cooking for most women. As can be seen, where electricity is being used to resist, challenge or redefine such norms, this seems to be occurring for a minority of women who are in positions of privilege or need relative to their peers. And these differences exist against a backdrop of an otherwise stable landscape of relatively slow changing social relations, which tend to minimize opportunities for change for most people. I've tried to visually depict this relationship here, although it's a much simplified version of a complex lived reality. I hope it helps to provide a sense of the broadly kind of divided or unequal cooking participation, practice participation patterns, and how the meanings of cooking seem to overlap with femininity in the case of cooking in this area, but not with masculinity for most women, most men. And in the Wayuu context, through the practice of weaving, it's very different, and electricity seems to be more transformative in its interactions with gender relations for most people, encouraging an expansion and arguably a greater equality in the performativity of femininity and masculinity. In this case, new electricity access seems to be interacting with a relatively fast-changing, more diverse, in terms of its gender and kind of less hierarchical landscape of social relations, which is providing various opportunities as well as needs for changing livelihood, practice, participation patterns for most women and men. And as such, new appliances like light bulbs and cell phone chargers and cell phones can be and are being used to redefine the significance of some practices, such as weaving, and who, defining who participates in them and how they're done. So again, here I've tried to visually depict this relationship, although simplified, trying to show how the meanings of weaving are overlapping with femininity, but also starting to overlap with masculinity, and how both this performativity of gender for both femininity and masculinity is in a state of flux and change. So as a final conclusion, therefore, I argue that the gender energy nexus is performative and therefore recursive, dynamic, power-filled and intersectional. And I suggest that this perspective has implications for gender energy research, policy and practice. Firstly, it moves us away and beyond from a blind assumption that electricity access is good for women, and that what is good for women equates to gender equality. And also highlights the need to adopt a grounded approach to the gender energy nexus that assumes everyone's lived experiences of electrification are personal, with someone's unique power-filled social identities influencing their gendered appliance use opportunities and outcomes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vicky. Thank you so much. That was tremendous. You've really you've reminded me of the richness of the material that you got from your research in your 2 locations in Latin America, but also the incredible analytical, conceptual architecture that you provided for your thesis. So it was really fascinating to be brought back into your research there. I'll expect people, if they want, to hold up a hand, or if not, to put in a chat question while people are warming up to do so. I wonder, you didn't mention your own positionality to the whole theme of your research, and there is a bit of background, a bit of hinterland there. I wonder if you want to briefly talk about how you got engaged with this topic.
Yes, yeah, of course.
And with the places, yeah.
Yeah. So I was studying my master's, so from a master's in development management, and I decided to quit my job in London and move to Guatemala because I heard about a guy there who was looking to start a pay-as-you-go energy, solar energy service, and connected with him. With my partner also, and so we worked to start Kingo, and I was involved in kind of understanding our customers and doing a lot of research in the communities, and I saw a kind of transition between what he was doing before we arrived and what we then did with Kingo, and with his first kind of attempt at trying to get electricity to these areas. This guy's called Juan. He was selling solar systems, and he found the need to offer microfinance loans, and he found there was a huge bottleneck, and the majority of his customers were men because they were the ones who had the property rights, and they could ask for loans from banks, and we had to do all of our kind of sales pitches at night so that the men were there from the field, and then when we switched to the pay-as-you-go model, I saw that our customer base changed considerably, and women became our main customers because they were the ones who would ordinarily buy candles from the local shops. And they could then say, give me a Kingo, give me a solar system, and I'll continue to just go to the shop and top my system up with codes, and you know, buy my electricity as I need it. And they were in charge of the budget as well for the house. And so I saw this really interesting dynamic, and I thought, I want to understand that better. And I could then see that, you know, there's a lot of complexity there. And actually at the time I was part of a UN kind of a network where we would share findings between ourselves with different people around the world trying to do a similar thing. And I saw that there was this kind of essentialization sometimes of the conversation around gender, you know, of women. And I thought that there's definitely more there, and I'd like to dig into that and really, you know, really understand what's happening. And then when we started to expand to Colombia, and I saw the matrilineal gender structure in the Wayuu tribes, I saw a very different situation occurring. So yeah, that was kind of the background of what led me to this.
Brilliant. Maybe I could invite you to elaborate on that then, in terms of what you would recommend for people doing some new piece of research on gender and energy nexus. What would you recommend to look for? What would be the steps people could take in their research practice to get closer up to the kinds of differences that, you know? I mean, there's one particular example I recall from your empirical chapters was about, about the Guatemala context. People were very anxious about watching TV in somebody else's house. There seemed to be a particular kind of way that the house itself was being sort of set up as a quasi, I think Polanyi might have said, autarkic kind of domestic structure. Very different then from the Colombian example that you got to. So that was the kind of example that hit me in your research of how differently the social life of everyday gendered worlds were playing out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would say really is that kind of that grounded approach to thinking that the gender energy nexus is going to be different in each context. And, you know, it's, I think having a practice, bringing together kind of a practice-based approach with the layers of gender studies insights of kind of thinking about the you know, the power relations, the intersectionality, the social relations that play out and are recursively part of those practices. I think that's how I would suggest somebody approaches it, that they go and they look at the practices taking place within a particular context. And I think, you know, trying to generalize across, we can't really say that, you know, the way that electricity intersects in one context is going to be the same as in another because of those rich social relations. And I think hopefully those two case studies highlighted, you know, how even within Latin America, with the very similar or the same pay-as-you-go solar energy service, the impact of what appliances are prioritized for is very different, and then how that kind of plays into gender performativity going forward.
Brilliant. Simone, you've got your hand up. Oh, I think you're muted. I can't hear.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. My computer's choosing some non-existent microphone. Yeah, thank you very much. That was really interesting. I was wondering why these appliances fit within a broader set of opportunities. Is it part of are there lots of competing systems, or how do people choose this one, or just kind of what else is going on in terms of electricity access in these same contexts? That would be quite interesting to know.
Yeah, and it's hard, sorry, to be able to kind of represent all of that quickly in a presentation. So within the first case study, the majority of people only had access to the pay-as-you-go solar energy system. Some people who perhaps were owners of shops also might have had access to a diesel generator. and people could also access diesel generators via churches. So part of my research looked at kind of electricity access and use within churches. And aside from that, there's nothing. The rural communities in Guatemala I visited are hours from any urban town, and they're not really connected with tarmac roads. So the electricity providers just don't go anywhere near those communities. And yeah, it's largely just the solar that reaches them. Some people did have some kind of solar systems they'd bought through people who had come through the community selling them, most of them in disrepair, because they lasted for a little while, and yeah, and that was it. And then in the second case study, again, just solar in the communities for the majority. Some of the settlements were nearer to roads, so there was some kind of hope for some of the communities that they might have access to the grid in time. But at the moment, yeah, just the pay-as-you-go solar energy service.
Thanks. And was there we've read, from some of Jane McCross's work, for example, that there's a sense that pay-as-you-go or solar kits are kind of fine so far as they go, but really people really want access to the grid. Did you find a similar sort of aspiration that was a goal?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. I think, there was a hope from a lot of people that this would perhaps help them in the meantime whilst the grid, hopefully came to their area. However, there were a lot of people who also used it kind of undergrid. So they were living in the communities where the grid did work. I didn't visit them as part of my research, unfortunately, but there were communities who were kind of, people were in rented accommodation, and therefore they couldn't connect to the grid. So yeah, it was maybe for available for some people, but unless they were to own their homes, they wouldn't ever gain access.
I think that resonates with some of the work that our project on energy on the move was finding in informal settlements, that there was nevertheless quite a bit of, as you say, under the grid, people getting access informally with extensions, and sometimes then the wiring gets very dodgy, and that's exactly when some of the women's NGOs who are working on safety and electricity usage really came into their own, I think, and they were learning quite significant safety practices, how not to get shocks as a result.
I did talk to somebody as well who said that he went off to work on some of the projects. I think potentially it's a very similar kind of context. And he was nervous about electricity because of what he'd seen. And he talked about how he liked solar, and he didn't even want the grid, actually, because he was nervous of those experiences.
Any other questions out there for our visitor, Vicky? I mean, I think
I'd like to ask, and I'd like to push your question, Ben, which is what will you do next? What's the next bit of research that's going to tell us more?
Thank you. Well, I'm working with Dave to kind of put this into a paper, as I mentioned. So really was kind of finalising the model, the framework from this work, and I'm actually working at Sussex in the Energy Demand Research Centre. And I'm looking at quite a different context at the moment. I'm looking at housing energy efficiency, retrofit, so how we make our homes more energy efficient. And I'm hoping that to use some of these insights within that context as well. I mean, I'd love any opportunities really to be able to continue to look at this this area, but I'm not sure what the future holds at the moment for where it will take me. I don't know if that answers your question, Simone. Yeah.
But I mean, it occurs to me that your work was so well organized and conducted that the possibility of a follow-up research to see, what's happened after so many years interval would be a very tempting prospect to go in and see what difference things have made by arrival of grid or new kinds of solar possibilities coming through, whether solar is developing in a distributed kind of way. That
Yeah.
would be a fascinating, different comparison of time lines to look
Yeah,
at.
definitely. And I think especially in Colombia and in La Guajira, where change is happening very rapidly. I think also, applying these ideas to a completely different context would be really beneficial from my perspective, because then seeing kind of how the kind of the framework of ideas partly came from the literature, but then was really developed and iterated on through what I was finding. And so I'm sure there's much more room for development of them, perhaps applying it in a completely different context altogether, and seeing what's learned there. I know there's been a lot around Kenya, for instance, of focus on solar.
Fantastic. My internet is telling me it's unstable. My connection is not 100% reliable. So I think we've just about run out of time. And I'd like to thank you so much, Vicky, for coming along. And
Ben.
let's see if we can make this recording available to our students as well, because I know some of our students were joining us, but there'll be others too who weren't able to sit through sit in on this seminar, so they enjoyed it enormously. And I think you've really you brought home very strongly the conclusion that one gets from most gender and energy studies of questioning your assumptions of what's happening, and the questioning of assumptions is kind of vital for all of us, and going into territories of new research as well. So thank you ever so much, and happy Christmas, and let's all get together soon for another low carbon energy for development network session.
That'd be brilliant. Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you for all of your guidance and
Okay.
about this research. And yeah, it's great to be here.
Good luck with everything.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Happy Christmas, and speak to you
Okay.
again soon.